Hello and fit like. My name is Pauline Cordiner and I am a storyteller from Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland. Now today I'm going to be doing a beginner's storytelling workshop for the Stonehaven Folk Festival. Unfortunately we can't all be there in person this weekend, however hopefully this will be a good second best. Now the workshop is for children as well as adults because stories are for everybody. Every human being on this earth is a natural listener to stories and also a natural teller of stories. I'm just going to help you bring that out a bit. So when we're children, we learn how to listen. Stories tell us how to listen. They teach us how to listen. You sit down and you look up at someone that's telling you a story. You're learning patience. You're learning that you sit and that you give your attention. When you're a child, you learn new words, language, sentence structure just by listening to a story. And of course, above all else, imagination. Without the pictures being shown in front of you, your mind is free to travel and wonder and picture your own characters, your own landscapes, and your own end to the story as well. But like I said, stories are not just for children. They're for adults too. Quite often when I've just told a story, I'll get an adult sneaking up to me and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, I was listening to the story, I was enjoying it even more than the children." Of course you were. That is because stories give us nurture, they give us comfort. Somebody is spending time sharing a story with you and they say eye to eye, mind to mind and heart to heart. And that's why I tell stories. I don't read stories. With a book in front of me, I feel that it's a bit of a physical barrier, something to hide behind. And by using your own words, and when I tell a story and when everybody tells a story, I suppose they're different words every time. So you're not restricted by somebody else's words. You can give your own interpretation of the characters, the way that they sound, the way that they're shaped, the way that they act. You can even change the end of the story. It's direct communication. There's nothing in between you and your audience. And of course, when you're telling a story, if the audience changes, you can change the story. If you can see that somebody's been particularly affected by that, you can change that as you go along. So today, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to choose your story. And the world is full of stories. There's lots and lots of different kinds. You've got your traditional stories, your folk tales, your fairy tales, your once upon a times, and your happily ever afters. But then, of course, there are local stories. Maybe you can think of one, and I'd like to see your comments below if there's a local story from your area that springs immediately to mind. Maybe it's why a mountain is shaped in a certain way, a river goes in a certain direction, or quite often why there's a great big boulder right in the middle of a field. Giants. So there's all those stories. Then of course there's stories from history. Maybe there was a particularly heroic person or a particularly wicked person that a story has been spun around. Also, stories, personal stories, things that you've experienced yourself. It might be funny things, it might be sad things, it might be things that touched your heart. And I'm particularly fond of family stories, things that happened to my granda. It's a valuable connection to people that are older than us and people that are younger than us, people that surround us every day in every way. And of course, people are making up new stories all the time. And I find that children are very, very good at that. We play lots of different games. Particularly, I've got a game where we take an object out of a bag and we bring the story along that way. Story cards, story dice. The world is your oyster, as they say. Where do you find stories to tell? Well, of course, You ask anyone, their answer is always books. When I first started off, I was looking particularly at a lot of folk tales. This is Aberdeenshire Folk Tales by Grace Banks and Sheena Blackhall. Lots and lots of local folktale books in whatever area you live in. Folktales from around the world. Huge range of books available. I'll probably put some of my favourites in the links down below. Your classic fairy tales, Brothers Grimm, Asbjornsen and Moe in Norway. And I'm quite a big fan of our local traveller storyteller, Stanley Robertson, whose books are, well, as you can see, mine are feathered with wee stickies telling me where to look for my story. So, where else can you find stories? Have a look at films, talk to people. Of course, as a storyteller, my number one suggestion should have been to go out and listen to other storytellers. Maybe we'll put some links to local storytelling groups in Great Britain and beyond, depending on the audience, after the session. And of course, at the moment with the coronavirus, a lot of storytellers have been recording their videos and putting them online. And over the space of 15 weeks, there is now an amazing wealth of people who had never ever sat down in front of a camera before and recorded themselves telling a story. They're all up online. Quite a lot of them are for people showing you their necks and chins, but but the stories are very good nonetheless. So, now that you've chosen your story, where do we go from then? So, have you chosen the first story that you want to tell? My advice is to start off with a story that appeals to you, something that reaches out to you. Not something with too complicated a storyline, and not something with too many things that you need to remember. Okay? So let's imagine that you've chosen your story, and if you have chosen a story that you'd want to learn, I want to see it down below in the comments, okay? So, how are you going to make that story your own? How are you going to learn that story? Now, people learn stories in all sorts of ways. I know some people who literally learn the whole thing off by heart. They write down their version of it and then they recite it. That's not the way that my brain works. And I know from having done a few different workshops that adults, children, boys, girls, everyone else, culture, all these things, just the way your brains work, can affect how you learn your story. I'm going to tell you how I do it. Don't learn the story by heart, learn it with your heart. I know that might sound a little bit cheesy, but it really does work for me. Remember that it's your story and it's you that's in control. Having said that, what I want you to do is, with your story, you can go and you can read it and read it and read it, or listening and listening, or if it's a video, watch it, and then I want you to put that source away. You're not paying any attention to it for the next part. Then what I want you to do is I want you to break that story down into 5, 6, or maybe 7 bullet points. So I'm going to give you an example. And the story that I usually use as an example is Cinderella, because that exists in so many different countries and cultures across the world. And if we think about the story of Cinderella, once upon a time, Cinderella, she's sad. She's unhappy because she's made to work as a servant for her stepmother and the stepsisters. That's the bullet point. Yes, you can have all the back history with her father marrying the stepmother and all that, but your main point is that she's sad and she's unhappy. And I picture to myself a little picture of Cinderella down on the ground scrubbing the floor. The second thing that happens is that the invitation arrives to the ball at the castle. Yes, you've got all the information for why there's a ball. The prince is looking for a wife. But the main thing is, invitation arrives. And although she's been invited by the prince, she's nae allowed to go by the rest of the family. So that's number 2. Number 3, everyone else swans off to the ball and Cinderella's there, probably still scrubbing the ground, when along comes the fairy godmother. Yeah, there's all the other information about the waving of the magic wand and the mice turning into coachmen and the pumpkin being turned into a coach, but your 3rd bullet point is fairy godmother turning up. Then Cinderella goes to the ball. She dances with the prince and it strikes midnight. The clock strikes midnight. She runs away and she leaves behind the glass slipper. So in my mind, that's my 4th bullet point, is the glass slipper. And then what happens? The prince collects the glass slipper and he goes around all the young ladies in the neighbourhood, all the different houses with the slipper, trying to slip it onto their feet to see who fits it. And finally, number 5, the slipper fits Cinderella's foot and we get our happily ever after. So that's my 5 bullet points. So if you say to me, you might have problems learning a story, yes, I have problems remembering stories at times. It does sometimes need quite a lot for a new story that talks to me to get that into my brain. But if I split it down into 5 sentences, I can remember that. If your mind works visually, you can get some pictures. So like I said, I have my picture in my mind of Cinderella scrubbing the floor. I've got a picture of an invitation in my mind. I've got a picture of the fairy godmother. I've got a picture of the glass slipper, and I've got a picture of happily ever after in my mind. If you're performing that story and you're doing it for the first time, who's to know if you put up 5 objects up at the back of the room? You're looking up and over the head of your audience, and there you've got an object and an object and an object. It's a cheat way that I often tell children if they have to do a presentation to the class. Nobody will know. Now, let's go for another example, because that one was a bit clear-cut. Another one that I've worked with children, primary school children, is the story of King Midas, which they really get into because you've got this horrendous man who loves gold. And that's your first bullet point. King Midas loves gold. What could be easier to remember than that? Now, the next part of the story is that Dionysus, the god of wine and parties, turns up at his palace, and along with Dionysus is one of his companions, Silenus. And Silenus wakes up the next morning. He's a little bit worse for the wear. He's been partying all night and he's fallen asleep in a bush. But King Midas, who does have a bit of a kind heart, he looks after Silenus, takes him into his palace, treats him well until he's feeling a lot better. And as a reward for that, bullet point number 2, Dionysus gives him a wish. So, we've had the bit about rescuing Silas, the giving of the wish. What's he going to wish for? Well, King Midas wishes that anything that he touches turns to gold. That is bullet point number 3. Now, children, if you're watching, I want to know what you would turn to gold. Because first of all, he's running around and he's touching cups, and he's got a golden cup. He's touching his bed. He's got a golden bed. Boys and girls do like for King Midas to have a golden toilet. I don't know why. I think it would be a bit cold, personally. But then, bullet point number 4, he's hungry. And he picks up his favourite food, a grape, and it turns to gold, and he can't eat it because it's solid gold. And at this point, he hasn't quite realised his problem, that everything he touches turns to gold, but the bread turns to gold, the meat turns to gold. And finally, he's so sad that when his daughter comes in, she wants to give him a bosie, she wants to give him a hug. She hugs him and the daughter turns to gold, and she's solid like a gold statue. So, sad bit, bullet point number 4. And then at the end, of course, he has to go and ask Dionysus, please, please take away this magic spell because it has turned into a curse. Dionysus tells him to go and wash his hands in the river. That's bullet point number 5. The magic is washed away, and as a nice consequence, as your nice happily ever after, King Midas realises that it's the people around you, not the objects, that make you happy. So he becomes kind and starts giving away his money, which I think is always quite a nice ending. So, you've got your 5 bullet points. Go off and learn them. Go off and learn them, and then once you've got that in your head, you can come back to your source. You can have another read through the story, you can have another listen to the story or watch the video or whatever, and you can see, is there anything that I've missed? Have I mixed out any huge chunk of the story? If the answer is no, and that's good. At this point, I'm going to mention that there are some stories that you shouldn't change too much. And these tend to be stories that belong inherently to a culture. For example, some of the Native American stories, the Scottish Traveller stories, for example, there's a lot of objects in those stories which have other meanings within those cultures. There was a story that I used to tell called Coy and the Cola Nut, and a boy inherits a tree laden with cola nuts. And to my mind, I was thinking, well, you know, he's going to be angry about that. But then I met a lady who explained to me that the cola nut was sacred in this boy's culture. And then the whole story completely changed. So if you've chosen a story which belongs to a particular culture, do have a bit of research into the objects and make sure that you're not changing the story too much. Apart from that, generally from that point on, you can build your story up. You can put in descriptions about the people in the stories, about their emotions, about the landscape. Think, for example, of how you would describe Cinderella when she turns up at the ball. What does she look like? What does the dress look like? Is it sparkling? Is it shimmering? How does the prince feel when he sets eyes upon her and falls madly in love with her at first sight? You develop characters. Comedy characters are always funny, and quite often you'll see in most stories there is a character that you can turn into a bit of a caricature. For children that are watching, that means a bit of a silly character. I would say, for example, Silenus, the little companion of Dionysus, when he's found in the king's garden. How was he acting? That's giving you a chance to act out his character a little bit more, and we'll come on to that in the next section of the workshop. Most of these things that you're going to add in will come with practicing the story. I know that there's some stories that I've told for years where all of a sudden there's like a goat and a granny. Everyone laughs at me because when the last time you told that story there wasn't a goat or there wasn't a granny. You do tend to add little bits in, and usually that comes from telling a story with an audience, and you kind of bounce things back and people shout things out, and it's all very good fun. But don't feel bad if your story sounds straight and stilted without much personality, that you haven't made it your own yet, because you haven't yet done the hard work, and that is practice. I know it sounds boring. It's not. The way that I practice a story is that I tend to do it when I'm going about the house, washing the dishes, or maybe when I'm falling asleep at night, I go over the story in my head, and then you're going to need to practice with a person. So, if there's any children that you can reel in, grannies and grandads in particularly love to hear a story. Any family members, pets. A child that I was working with told me that she went home and she told the story to the dog, because dogs don't judge. And the dog sat there the whole way through, woo, 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 and that was perfect. If you don't have any of those things, what I used to do before I had a daughter was I used to line up cuddly toys. So anything like that. Paper plate with a face drawn on it. I know at the moment with a lot of storytellers recording stories directly onto their phones or tablets, that quite a lot of people early on, I for one, were missing a live audience. So in the background I had some teddy bears lined up just to imagine that there was a real audience. So next section will be how to present your story and how to engage your audience. So let's imagine that you've chosen your story, that all-important first story that you want to tell, and that you've been off and you've broken it down to its bare bones and you've built it up again, put the flesh on that bones, and you've had a wee practice. So how are we going to make that story a little bit more exciting, a little bit more colourful, a little bit more appealing to draw your audience in? Well, the first thing I'm going to cover is the space that you're in. You might be up on a big stage. You might be in a care home with a group of people surrounding you in chairs, or you might have 30 school children all around your feet, getting closer and closer every time. How you use your space is up to you. I'm a fidget. I move about. I fill whatever space I have. But it's not just about filling that space with your body, whether you're walking around and pacing around. You can show movement just by moving your hands, by your hand gestures. I want to mention placement. If you have a person in a story who's maybe smaller and one character's talking down to them, just remember that that character, if they're replying, has to talk back up. If you have an object, make sure it stays in one place. There's a story I do about Raven, and Raven comes up through a hole into another world up above, and I always have to make sure that when Raven goes back to that hole, that the hole's down here. If the hole suddenly appears over there, it doesn't work. People get confused. So use your space. The other thing, of course, that I mentioned briefly there is your body movement. You can use your whole body. Some people sit down to tell stories. I sometimes sit down depending on the situation. Sometimes I stand up. If you're portraying an old man with a walking stick, you might want to get up and act that out. You've got your hand gestures in this area here. Hand gestures particularly help people who are hard of hearing, or younger children who are used to Makaton and other similar hand gestures. And then finally you've got your physog, you've got your face, you've got your facial expressions, your grumpy people, your innocent people, people falling in love, people being very upset. Play with that, have fun. But if you don't feel comfortable doing it, you do not have to. I do it because that's just the kind of person that I am. My mother never told me to stop making silly voices and silly faces when I was a child. But if it's not in your comfort zone, you can quite easily just sit and tell the story and say that the king was angry rather than contorting your face. Which brings me, of course, onto voice. Your voice is the most wonderful thing when you're telling a story. I do want to mention, if you're telling stories regularly, particularly if you're nervous and highly strung, do have a warm-up. I used to suffer from bad voice loss because quite often I would just launch into shouting giants and donkeys, and then I would find that I didn't have a voice afterwards. So, bearing that in mind, you can change your voice when you're narrating, obviously, when you're telling the story for the children, as well as when you're doing a character. Once again, don't feel that you need to do characters' voices. It's entirely up to you. But ways that you can change your voice. You can change the pitch of your voice. And that means if you're speaking in a low voice, or if you're speaking in a very, very high-pitched voice. What kind of characters change their voice? Well, pitch will change with the age of a character sometimes. Small children tend to speak very, very quietly and very, very high-pitched in stories. If they're male, if they're female. The size of a character. You know, if you've got a giant, usually the giant's voice is big and loud. A tiny little mouse would have a tiny little voice like that. You can mess around with it, of course, and you can have a tiny little mouse who's got a very, very deep, very macho voice. That could be quite funny. And also emotion. The pitch of your voice is going to change with the emotion of the character. Intonation. And for the children, that means if you're speaking in a voice where everything is exactly the same note, or if you're speaking a little bit like they do down in Glasgow, where your voice goes up and down and up and down. That's another way that you can change for your characters. It tends to be that if you are telling a story in a voice like this, that people will very quickly switch off. So if you can bring a bit of intonation into your voice, give that a go. Your accent and your language, use it. Be aware that people in your audience might not understand the words that you're saying, but that is fine as long as you explain afterwards. So I'm from Aberdeen. I do speak a wee bit of Doric every now and again, but if I see that there's people in the audience, as soon as you see a wrinkled face, you know that you need to start translating immediately afterwards. So for example, there was this week when he came louting down the street. This little girl came running down, jumping down the street. It's very easy to just bring in your translations immediately after as part of the story, and it'll work seamlessly. Likewise, if you're from another country or you speak another language, use that, because it is beautiful to hear, you know, like a wee bit of Polish thrown in, a wee bit of Arabic thrown in. Songs, if you've got a wee snippet of a song that somebody might be singing, stick that in as well. It's colourful, it's beautiful, and it keeps traditions going. Okay, but at all times when you're telling the story, make sure that you're clear, that your voice is clear, you're loud enough for everyone to hear, and that you're not going too fast. I do find that when I'm telling stories, I've got 3 different voices, and one is my voice for people who might have problems listening to me. I've got my normal voice, and then I've got telling stories to my friends. You know, it's a lot less intelligible. Volume, use volume. Angry characters are going to be loud. Confident characters are going to be loud. But don't shout at your audience. Likewise, if you're working with a group who are starting to lose attention, a great tip I was given was just stop and pause and bring your voice down. Even the most distracted of children will stop looking around and will go, oh, what's happening? What's happening? And they'll draw in close. Feel free to allow emotions to show through in your stories, and also each individual character, there's a lot that you can demonstrate about their personality by changing your voice without actually describing their personality before. So that's a little bit on how I like to tell my stories, but as I said before, don't feel that you need to be out there and shouting and making funny faces, because a story told by someone who loves that story and who has got the patience to sit down and give you eye contact and tell you that story is still, to me, the most wonderful storyteller. Okay, now, got a wee final section here. Nerves. Aye, dinna worry. First time you tell a story, you're going to be nervous. I know that children at school these days get a lot more opportunities of standing up in front of the class and speaking. In my day, we didn't get that. I was maybe about 21 when I told my first story, 23. And I've just given my age away there, haven't I? If you were paying attention earlier. Oh, never mind. And I was never brought up with public speaking. So to discover that knowing something like a story, which always goes the same way, the confidence that that gave me was amazing. You'll feel nervous to start off with, but you are in charge. What are you nervous about? Making mistakes. Right. If you make mistakes, nobody needs to know. I have seen the most practiced and wonderful storytellers make a mistake. I've known it's a mistake because I've heard them tell that story 10 times before, and it is a wonder to see someone cover up their mistake. Because it's your story, and because it's you bringing it out the way you want to tell it, you can tell that story in any order. So let's imagine that Snow White has taken a bite from the apple, and I forgot to mention the whole bit where the wicked queen mixes up a potion and dips the apple in it. So Snow White took a bite of the apple and she bit into it. Oh no, I've missed a bit out. But what Snow White didn't know was that the queen had spent the whole night making a potion, mixing in darkness and hatred, and she had dipped that apple within so that one bite of that apple would cause death. You know, you can make that up. If there's any interruptions, and yeah, there's somebody's mobile phone goes up, you can either ignore it or you can bring it into the story. Likewise, any sort of interruptions. So long as you know your story well, you can pause the story, you can interact with that hyperactive audience member, you can get feedback from everybody, and then you can just take that in and continue with the story. And as Stanley Robertson once said, just breathe it in and bring it out, Bonnie. So I think that brings us to the end of this online workshop for the Stonehaven Folk Festival. There's so much more I could say. Maybe sometime we'll meet in person and we can do the workshop the way I'd normally do it, interacting with people and getting opinions. There's going to be a wee question and answer session afterwards. So if you would like to ask any questions at all, within reason, type them in down below and I can answer them, hopefully. Thank you very, very much for joining. I can't wait to see all of your stories sometime. If you're even brave enough to make a video and put it online, tag it in the comments below and maybe I can see them. Thank you very, very much for listening, and thank you also to the Stonehaven Folk Festival, and enjoy the rest of the workshops and the rest of your weekend. My name is Pauline Cordiner. I'm a storyteller from the northeast of Scotland. You can find more stories online. Just Google Pauline Cordiner Scottish Storyteller and you'll find story videos and web pages and Facebooks and all that kind of thing. And if I can help out in any way, just ping me a message. Thanks again. Bye-bye.